My name is irrelevant to the people who laughed at me that morning. To them, I was already a woman who had lost everything. My husband leaned back in his chair, smirking like the divorce was just another business deal he'd already won. His mistress sat beside him wearing the smile of someone who thought she had stolen not just my marriage, but my future too. She whispered loudly enough for the courtroom to hear. She doesn't deserve a single dime. Everyone expected me to cry. Instead, I quietly handed the judge a sealed letter I'd carried in my purse for months. My husband actually laughed when he saw it. Another emotional speech, he mocked. But the moment the judge opened the envelope, skimmed the first page, and suddenly burst into laughter, the entire courtroom fell silent. Then he looked directly at my husband and calmly said, "Well, this changes absolutely everything. Before we dive in, take 1 second to like and subscribe. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from by commenting your country below." Now, let's get started with today's story. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 28 years old. If you'd asked me a year earlier where my marriage was headed, I would have told you we were building a future together. Instead, I found myself sitting in a family courtroom, waiting for a judge to decide how the final chapter of our marriage would end. The room felt strangely quiet despite being full of people. Papers shuffled, lawyers whispered, and somewhere behind me someone cleared their throat. Across the aisle sat my husband, Daniel, wearing the same confident smile he'd perfected ever since he became successful. He didn't look nervous. He looked entertained. When our eyes met, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You'll never touch my money again," he said loud enough for several people nearby to hear. Sitting beside him was the woman he'd left me for. She crossed one leg over the other, smiled sweetly, and added, "She doesn't deserve a single dime anyway." A few heads turned toward me, expecting tears, anger, or some desperate outburst. I gave them none. Instead, I quietly rested one hand on my purse, where a sealed handwritten letter waited inside. I hadn't brought it to beg for sympathy. I hadn't written it out of revenge. I carried it because sometimes the truth doesn't need the loudest voice. It only needs the right person to read it. When I first met Daniel, neither of us had much. He was an ambitious young entrepreneur with more ideas than money, and I was working full-time as a marketing coordinator while taking freelance design projects on weekends. We rented a tiny apartment where the kitchen table doubled as his office and my workspace. Back then, success wasn't guaranteed. There were months when I quietly paid most of the bills because one of his business plans hadn't worked out. I never kept score. I believed marriage meant building something together, especially when life became difficult. Many evenings ended with us sitting across from each other, sketching ideas on notepads over cheap takeout dinners. I'd help refine his presentations, design logos, proofread investor emails, and encourage him whenever another opportunity fell apart. Watching him finally succeed felt like watching both our dreams come true. But somewhere between his first major contract and the luxury house he insisted we buy, Daniel changed. He became impatient, dismissive, and strangely protective of everything he'd earned. Conversations turned into arguments. Late-night meetings became routine, and unexplained business trips suddenly filled his calendar. The truth arrived one ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I accidentally saw messages on his tablet that no wife should ever read. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. Instead, I quietly accepted something my heart had been avoiding for months. Our marriage wasn't breaking. It was already over. People often assume that staying silent means you've given up. In my case, silence became my greatest advantage. After discovering Daniel's affair, I stopped arguing. I stopped asking questions he would only answer with half-truths. Instead, I focused on protecting myself. Every financial document I legally had access to, every email sent to me, every household record, and every conversation that directly affected our shared life was carefully organized. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was preserving the truth before it disappeared beneath expensive lawyers and confident speeches. The one thing nobody knew about wasn't hidden inside a safe or stored on a computer. It was a handwritten letter Late one evening, after reading through hundreds of pages of legal documents, I realized something important. The official paperwork explained the facts, but it couldn't explain the bigger picture. So I wrote a respectful letter addressed to the judge, carefully pointing toward details already contained within the evidence. I wasn't asking for sympathy or special treatment. I simply wanted to make sure nothing important was overlooked. When my attorney read it, he quietly nodded and sealed it inside an envelope. Daniel, meanwhile, became more arrogant with every passing week. His confidence only grew stronger as settlement meetings passed in his favor. By the morning of our final hearing, he looked completely certain he had already won. I carried the sealed letter into court without saying a single word. When our case was finally called, the courtroom grew so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock behind the judge's bench. Daniel walked confidently to his seat, straightened his expensive suit, and smiled as though he were about to close another profitable business deal instead of ending a marriage. His attorney presented their arguments first, emphasizing the prenuptial agreement and insisting there was no reason to deviate from its terms. Daniel barely looked at me. He seemed more interested in watching my reaction than listening to the proceedings. Then he leaned toward me and whispered, "After today, you'll never ask me for another cent." His mistress, seated in the gallery behind him, couldn't resist adding, "She should be grateful she's getting anything at all." I simply stood when my attorney nodded. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "before the hearing concludes, may I respectfully submit one personal letter for your consideration?" The judge accepted the sealed envelope without comment. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "What is this?" he muttered. "One last emotional goodbye." The judge unfolded the pages and quietly began reading. His expression stayed completely neutral for several moments. Then he paused, reached for the case file beside him, and carefully compared several documents. A few seconds later, he let out a brief laugh, not a mocking laugh. The kind people make when an overlooked detail suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. He looked toward both attorneys. "I have a few questions," he said. For the first time that entire morning, Daniel's confident smile disappeared. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The judge adjusted his glasses, looked from the letter to the evidence already filed with the court, and then back toward Daniel's attorney. "Counsel," he said evenly, "would you please explain why these financial disclosures don't appear to match the timeline established by your own exhibits?" The confidence in Daniel's lawyer's face faded almost instantly. He shuffled through several folders, flipping pages faster than before, clearly searching for an explanation. Daniel finally leaned forward. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he interrupted. The judge calmly raised a hand. "Mr. Brooks, you'll have an opportunity to speak. For now, I'd like your attorney to answer." The courtroom became so quiet that every turning page seemed unusually loud. My letter hadn't introduced new evidence. It had simply connected details that had been sitting inside the case file all along. Once the judge followed those references, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Daniel's mistress stopped smiling altogether. She glanced nervously toward him, but for the first time since the hearing began, he didn't look back. Instead, he stared at the documents spread across his attorney's table. When the judge invited me to speak, I answered every question honestly and without exaggeration. I never raised my voice or insulted Daniel. I simply explained the sequence of events exactly as they had happened. By the time I finished, nobody in the courtroom was looking at me with pity anymore. They were listening with respect. After a brief recess, everyone returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere had completely changed. Daniel no longer looked like a man certain of victory. He sat quietly beside his attorney, avoiding my eyes for the first time since the hearing had begun. The judge carefully explained that his decision would be based on the evidence presented throughout the case and the clarifications prompted by my letter. After reviewing everything, he ruled that the settlement would reflect the complete financial picture established by the record, ensuring a fair outcome under the law. Daniel's shoulders dropped. His attorney gave a slow nod, already understanding there was little left to argue. Behind him, His mistress quietly gathered her purse and slipped out of the courtroom without saying a word. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I didn't look at Daniel expecting an apology because I knew one was incoming. Instead, I took a slow breath as months of fear quietly lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking away defeated. I was walking away with the truth finally acknowledged. 6 months after the divorce, my life looked completely different. I opened my own branding and design studio, surrounded myself with people who valued honesty, and slowly rediscovered the confidence I'd almost forgotten I had. Some mornings I still thought about that courtroom, but not because of the judge's decision. I thought about the letter. It hadn't magically won my case. It had simply helped the truth find its voice. Looking back, I realized Daniel's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence. It was believing silence meant surrender. Sometimes people mistake calmness for weakness because they've never met someone who no longer needs to prove anything. If my story has taught me one lesson, it's this: you don't always win by speaking the loudest. Sometimes you win by staying patient, protecting the truth, and refusing to let bitterness define your future. The day I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't just leave my marriage behind. I finally walked into the peaceful life I deserved.